So hi everyone, my name is Lisbeth Kazir. I work with ISD's infrastructure team and coordinate our work under the Nature-Based Infrastructure Global Resource Center, or in short NBI Center, as we like to say. And we're really excited to be here today. Our first webinar of our deep dive series on how to value nature-based infrastructure for water management. It's great seeing so many of you here. We have a couple of quick housekeeping rules. So we'd like to ask you to keep your microphones on mute, certainly during the presentations, perhaps during the Q&A. If you have a pressing question, raise your hand, or otherwise do write us in the chat. We'll be picking up questions from there. And we'll also record today's session. There's a couple of colleagues and partners who are not able to join us here today, but we'll circulate the recording afterwards. So just by means of introduction, this series, the NBI Deep Dive series, is part of our training offering of our Nature-Based Infrastructure Center. Some of you may have been part of our 5-week training courses last year on how we value nature-based infrastructure and how do we make the case for more investments in nature. So some of you may have seen myself and some of the colleagues here previously. Drop us a line if that's the case. We'd actually love to hear who's there from last year's training. And one of the feedbacks that we received from quite a lot of people is that it would be useful to actually dive in a little bit more detail into the case studies and examples of how we can value different pieces of nature-based infrastructure, in this case, as you see on the slide, for water management. So what we'll be doing today is kick that off, diving into the tools and methods for valuing the water management infrastructure services that nature can bring us. And we'll do that by means of 2 examples, looking at stormwater solutions in Johannesburg in South Africa. And we'll also look at the case of mangrove restoration in Indonesia. So for those of you who are joining us in the NBI Center for the first time, let me give you a 2-minute background on our work. The NBI Center is an initiative that was launched 2 years ago with the aim of scaling up and supporting the scaling up of the use of nature for climate adaptation and infrastructure services. And one of the barriers that we're trying to address, one of the barriers to scale investment in nature, is that the economic and financial performance is not well understood, especially not in comparison with the performance of gray built infrastructure. And that actually leads many of us, governments, investors, project developers, lead us to invest and construct projects by default in rather unsustainable ways. And so with the NBI Center, we really try to change that narrative by providing more evidence that nature and nature-based infrastructure can provide cost-effective infrastructure services. So when we think about nature-based infrastructure, we think about sand dunes and mangroves instead of built flood protection walls. And the reason why we need to make those economic and financial valuations is to demonstrate that nature actually provides that cost-effective solution. And not only does it do that, it also delivers a wealth of co-benefits that will sometimes materialize like added health benefits or carbon sequestration potentials. And sometimes it will materialize under the form of avoided costs, avoided damages being done through including the impacts of climate change. So the questions we're really trying to address are, could we avoid investing in built gray water infrastructure solutions by maintaining forests and wetlands? How will different stormwater infrastructure options deal with more extreme rainfall? How do we address that question? Which coastal protection investment provides better value for money, a sea dike or a mangrove forest? And those are some of the questions that we'd like to talk to you about today, including through those two case studies. So what's really critical is that we need to start deploying the methods to answer the questions, and we need to value the infrastructure services and benefits that nature provides, because otherwise it will be very hard for governments and investors to make investments flow into nature. So we are really on that mission to value as many nature-based infrastructure projects globally as possible over the next few years, and to improve the methodologies that we use to evaluate and to keep disseminating this knowledge. And so to that end, here at ISD, we are working with a toolbox that we've termed the Sustainable Asset Valuation methodology to provide integrated valuations and scenario analysis to help investors, planners, policymakers, decision makers in the infrastructure space to make informed decisions about investing in nature-based infrastructure. So I'm really pleased to be here and to be moderating here today the session that will dive into more detail on how we've been using the methodology on stormwater infrastructure and mangrove restoration. And so without further ado and too much talking from my end, I would like to introduce you to my colleagues. We have today with us Ronja Bechau. Ronja is an urban planner and sustainable infrastructure specialist who works with our team, and she'll introduce you to the valuation of natural stormwater solutions in South Africa. We also have my colleague Emma Cutler here, our system dynamics modeler, who will speak to you about the mangrove restoration in Indonesia. And I believe we also have my colleague Georg Palaske on the line, who is also a system dynamics modeler and who's worked, among others, on the architecture of the SAVi models and the incorporation of climate data into the assessments. So a warm welcome also to the colleagues, and then I'll be handing this over to Ronja for the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lisbeth. And thank you all for joining today. It's great to see so many familiar names on the list here. A very warm welcome also from my side. So the SAVi case study I will present today is about stormwater infrastructure in South Africa. The report is available for download online, so maybe one of my colleagues can also share the link to the report with you in the chat. So as Lisbeth mentioned, SAVi combines different tools and methodologies, and this case study, I think, is particularly interesting for looking at how we used climate data in the assessment. So the project we looked at here is located in Johannesburg's Patterson Park precinct. We worked closely with the development planning department of the City of Johannesburg. And Johannesburg faces many challenges that are also familiar to other cities around the world. There are rising problems with flash floods from extreme rainfall. There's water scarcity because of prolonged droughts. And the city is facing heat waves, water quality issues, biodiversity is declining, and there's also a general degradation of natural areas. And to address these challenges and increase the quality of life in the Patterson Park precinct, the city upgraded the stormwater infrastructure in the area and integrated it into a green space in Patterson Park. And we came in with SAVi to analyze different options for these stormwater infrastructure upgrades. So we analyzed 3 options that you see here on the slide: the gray infrastructure option, a hybrid one, and a nature-based option. So the gray infrastructure option was a classic civil engineered concrete culvert, so a kind of concrete water channel. The hybrid option combined a piece of such a culvert with a renaturalized stream section. And this is also the option that Johannesburg built. But we also looked at a fully nature-based infrastructure option where the entire stretch of the stream was renaturalized. Here on the slide, you also see a 4th box, right? And this is because in SAVi, we always compare our infrastructure options to a baseline or a business as usual scenario. So we compared these three infrastructure options to a baseline scenario with an existing concrete culvert that did not have the capacity to properly deal with the stormwater in Patterson Park. For these three infrastructure options, we did a cost-benefit analysis over a 20 and a 40-year time frame. And we also looked at how this cost-benefit analysis changes when we look at different climate scenarios for Johannesburg. So let's have a short look at these climate scenarios that we considered in this assessment. We looked at 4 different ones. I will just briefly turn on my pointer here. So we looked at 4 different climate scenarios based on 4 representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. RCP 8.5 in this case is the scenario with the highest climate change, and RCP 2.6 with lower climate change. And you see here on the slide several peaks for the precipitation in Johannesburg. And whenever we have such a peak in the graph, it means an extreme precipitation event. So for example, you see here that the orange line for RCP 8.5, strong climate change, has a lot of these peaks, so a lot of extreme rainfall events. Especially here around 2050, there's really extreme rainfall in Johannesburg. And we compare this, for example, to RCP 6, where we see there's not so many extreme rainfall events. So this is a less extreme scenario. You see the big differences between these climate scenarios. And this we will also later on see in the cost-benefit analysis, because it really influenced the numbers for the different infrastructure options. So let's turn right to the cost-benefit analysis for stormwater infrastructure in Johannesburg. The CBA included direct costs, added benefits, and avoided costs. So it included capital and maintenance costs. We looked at increased property values and increased property tax revenues, because the green space with the stormwater infrastructure had a positive impact on properties in the area. We looked at income creation, especially from the maintenance jobs from the NBI, and the additional water supply, because more water can infiltrate into the ground and be available. And it included avoided costs, especially avoided flood damages and avoided cost of carbon. You see here on the slide that 2 indicators are in italics, and this is because these indicators are influenced by the climate scenarios. So water supply and the flood damages are influenced by our climate scenarios. And on the next slide, you see the cost-benefit analysis table for the 20-year time frame. So you see the cost up here, you have all the different benefit items, and you have the 3 infrastructure options we analyzed: the gray, the hybrid, and the NBI. And what I would like to highlight down here is the benefit to cost ratio. So for each rand or each dollar that we invest in these projects, how much do we get in return for society? How much value do we get? And we see that for the hybrid solution, for each rand invested, we get a return of 1.7 rand. And when we renaturalize the whole stream, for each rand invested, we get more than 3 in return for society. So the cost-benefit analysis shows us that these 2 options are really investment worthy. And I think it's even more interesting when we look at a longer time period of 40 years. So here again, you see that the numbers change. And I want to highlight this part about the benefits. The hybrid and the full NBI options provide benefits in this case that the gray infrastructure culvert cannot provide by design. The gray culvert cannot improve property values by greening the area, for example. It also does not improve the water supply. And we also see in the assessment that the nature-based infrastructure is better able to avoid flood damages. So we see these huge benefits down here for the options that involve NBI. And these benefits are really what make the projects investment worthy and what leads us to these positive net results for the infrastructure options. And as I said before, we also looked at how these numbers, how this cost-benefit analysis changes when we consider different climate scenarios. So on the next slide, we see the 3 different infrastructure options, gray, hybrid, NBI, for the 4 different climate scenarios. And you see that no matter what climate scenarios we look at here, the NBI performs better because it has these huge benefits. So in all these scenarios, the hybrid and the fully renaturalized stream provide more value. The biggest one is always here in light blue, the avoided flood damages from the NBI, but in dark blue, we also see the additional water supply that makes an impact here. Let's look at the 40 years, because I think that's more interesting. Here you see even higher avoided flood damages. And we see large differences between the RCP6 and the 8.5 scenario in the graphs. When you think back to the graph I showed about the climate scenarios, we had a lot of these extreme rainfall events, a lot of these spikes for the 8.5 scenario. And we had relatively few of these extreme rainfall events for the RCP6 scenario. And that is the difference we see here. In a scenario with strong climate change, with extreme precipitation, the NBI really unfolds the greatest value here. And in a scenario where we don't have so much extreme precipitation, we don't see that big value. So it really makes a difference whether we consider these climate scenarios or not. And that already brings me to some key messages for this assessment. So we've seen that the integrated cost-benefit analysis highlights the infrastructure services from the nature-based infrastructure, especially this huge graph about the flood protection. And in the CBA, you've also seen all the co-benefits that the NBI can provide. So over the life cycle of the infrastructure, the hybrid solution and renaturalizing the entire stream are the most cost-efficient investments. The NBI provides many additional benefits that the gray infrastructure by design can't provide in this case. The second point is that the integration of climate scenarios supports informed decision-making for climate adaptation. Under different climate change scenarios, the case for investing in nature-based infrastructure becomes even clearer. The more volatile the precipitation patterns become in our analysis, the larger are the benefits of the NBI in comparison to the gray infrastructure. And lastly, the SAVi assessment helps us to predict and compare NBI and other infrastructure options. It really helps us to compare NBI to gray infrastructure and other solutions. And this can help us overcome the reliance on gray infrastructure and use the funds for infrastructure and climate adaptation more efficiently. I know this was a lot of information, and I can imagine you have questions. So I'm already going to hand it back to Lisbeth for the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronja, for this presentation, and thanks so much to everyone to already put some questions in the chat. In case you would want to take the floor, feel free to raise your hand, but otherwise, what I will do is also read out loud some of the questions that I think, Georg, you also already started answering. But it would be great to hear both Ronja and Georg's reflections on some of the questions. One question that came in is on why the concrete culvert doesn't have benefits from avoided flood damages. And now I know, Georg, you started responding to that already in the chat, but I think this is a great question for us to consider for discussion. So perhaps you want to unmute yourself and come in on that aspect. And then another question, and perhaps bouncing that to Ronja, is on potential negative values coming out from nature-based solutions. So if I could ask you both to unmute yourself and take up those questions also for discussion, please. You're on mute, Georg. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. So yes, it's a good question and a valid question. And for SAVi assessments, we essentially always have to consider a baseline situation. So what is the current status quo, and what do we stand to gain, and what do we have to invest in order to intervene? And so therefore, the choice of a baseline situation is determines what is going to be the baseline damages as well as baseline costs against which various alternatives are compared. And so in the case of South Africa, we chose the grey covert as the baseline situation. And so based on that, we have then estimated the additional investment that is required for partial or full renaturalization, as well as the avoided flood damages and other potential benefits that may come forth from the implementation of the interventions. And so if you want to kind of extrapolate that to other situations, like, for example, a wastewater treatment plant, like we will talk about in the next webinar, then the currently installed plant would be the baseline situation against which alternatives are assessed. And so in doing that, we are essentially saying the business as usual scenario, hence the baseline, is a situation where we just continue as we have done before. And the various policies scenarios or intervention scenarios are what if cases, where we then look at what are the additional costs, what are the avoided costs, and what are the added benefits that result from acting, essentially.
Thank you, Georg. Ronja, do you want to add to this or take up the question on the potential negative outcomes for NBS?
Sure, I can come in for the question about whether we sometimes see a negative result for NBS. I would say in none of the assessments I've seen so far, when we included all the relevant avoided costs and added benefits of the NBS, then we usually don't see a negative value for it. But it is really important to include these factors, because when we just do the, let's say, the classic cost benefit analysis, where we really only look at the investment cost and the maintenance cost, it's often the case that the grey infrastructure seems to perform better. So it is important to take this integrated perspective in the cost benefit analysis. Yeah, maybe some of the colleagues want to add here.
I think that's there's a follow-up question from Robert, and then one question from Alberto that we should also look at. So maybe the quick follow-up here, Georg, so are the results saying that the hybrid and nature-based options were also the best at reducing flood-related damages?
So yes, I will, I think, first address Robert's question, and then also in the same vein, try to address Alberto's question. So what the results have shown is that the partial and the full renaturalization of the stream leads to a better outcome in comparison to the grey culvert. So that is due to the fact that the renaturalization of the stream makes so that the flood, like that there's more of a buffer zone, and that leads to the flood damage function being less erratic than with the grey culvert. I'm not going to go much more technical, but that is ultimately the explanation, that we have more of a buffer that kind of catches the water before it comes out of the stream and causes flood damages to occur. And the ecosystem services considered in the cost benefit analysis are usually quantified using market and non-market valuation methods, such as, for example, I think in the case of Johannesburg, we had also the additional costs of water provisioning. And so in this instance, we quantified the amount of additional water that can percolate into the groundwater aquifers. And that quantity of water was then multiplied by the average value or the average cost per cubic meter of water in the city of Johannesburg. So we always try to we always estimate the biophysical flows, and then, like, for example, the cubic meters of water or the number of buildings that are not damaged. And then we multiply it by an average value per cubic meter of water, or by an average damage per building damage in a flood.
Thank you, Georg, and thanks also to Alberto for that question. There's a last question from Alice. how and why did the city of Johannesburg decide to go for the hybrid infrastructure at the end?
For me?
If you can, I have some thoughts on that, but you can go first, Georg, as you were the lead in the assessment.
Sure, I think that there were several reasons why the city of Johannesburg was going for the partial revitalization. The one was because obviously there were issues with flood water management, and they wanted to try a new approach. But on the other side, they also worked the project, to my knowledge, and Lisbeth, correct me if I'm wrong, fell into the climate resilience strategy of the city and also into the ambition of the city to create more green spaces. So the renaturalization of the stream, hence, they contributed to achieving a number of objectives that the city of Johannesburg had outlined for itself.
Some more questions coming in, which is great. A follow-up question from Alice around cultural services, and whether that was taken into account into this specific case study, and maybe if not, if you have a reflection, Georg, in relation to how you approach assessments from a qualitative as well as quantitative perspective. Maybe you can share a few things on that.
I can give two examples which are kind of which are on the opposite sides of the spectrum with regard to that question. So first of all, no, we did not consider cultural services performed in this instance, because the cultural services, it's similar to, for example, recreation. And the recreation can be valued in a number of things, or in a number of ways. And one of the ways in which you could quantify something like that is the willingness to pay. That is where researchers go out and they ask a lot of people, what would you be willing to pay if this would be a green space rather than like a usual concrete place? And so based on that value, the willingness to pay, you could then quantify the value of these cultural services. Now, on the other hand of the spectrum is, for instance, the impact of green spaces on real estate value. There's studies out there that kind of have analyzed how the park development in an area has contributed over time to an increase in the real estate value of the surrounding buildings. And so in that instance, we would, for instance, look at what is the average value either per hectare or per building. And then we would multiply that by the respective percentage increase in value that we have obtained from studies. Of course, all of the multipliers and the methodological approaches used for this assessment were double and triple checked with stakeholders of the City of Johannesburg. So this is not, so all of the parameters that we have applied here are vetted by local stakeholders that have reviewed them and said, okay, yeah, it makes sense to include this. And it is also okay to use this multiplier, or they have provided us with a different multiplier to ensure that their assessment results are as close to the ground as possible. And opportunity costs are, to very briefly address that also, included at a point of, wherever it is applicable. For instance, like we have if we look, for example, at land use or space required for a specific intervention or implementation. Like if we now take for one moment power generation, if we take a coal power plant, it doesn't require a lot of space. But if we take a solar plant that generates the same amount of electricity as the coal power plant, we need a lot more space. And so that value, there would be an opportunity cost to the land use, the additional land use for solar, if that land was to be used for productive purposes, such as, for example, agriculture. If it was to be used for agriculture, or if it currently is agriculture land, then we would estimate the amount of additional land that is required to establish that solar farm, and then assume a production value and a value added per hectare used to quantify that additional cost that comes with using the land for power generation rather than for agriculture production. So it's always important that you kind of stick to what is the current land use and whether there's actually competing uses of land. And the same kind of thinking can be applied to all other, like to other externalities and other opportunity costs, such as, for example, water use and others.
Thank you so much, Georg, and I hope that also towards the participants answered some of your questions. There are some that will perhaps keep for responding in the chat, and we'll come back to. But I would like to also introduce now my colleague Emma, who will be speaking on the assessment of mangrove restoration in Indonesia. And we'll have time also after that presentation for some more questions and answers. But thank you very much, Ronja and Georg.
Right. Thank you, Lisbeth. So as Lisbeth mentioned, for our next case study, I'm going to present an assessment we did looking at mangrove restoration in Indonesia. So first, just to give a little bit of background to this assessment. We were looking on the island of Belitung, and this is an area with a lot of tin mines. And these mines are a very important piece of the local economy, but they've also encroached on mangrove forests. And with the loss of mangroves, we've also lost a lot of ecosystem services in this area. So for example, there's been a decrease in biodiversity. This has hurt fishery production in this area. The shrimp fishery is particularly important. Also, mangroves help to protect against erosion and flooding. So as they disappear, damages from these events have gotten worse. And then, of course, when mangroves are lost, there's a decrease in the amount of carbon that's stored in the ecosystem. So in response, there was an effort to come together and create a mangrove park. So this mangrove park was created both to restore the mangroves, but also to develop an ecotourism industry in the area. This project was implemented with very strong community engagement. So people were involved, the local community was involved in all aspects, including planting mangroves, helping to protect the mangroves, and then of course, being involved in this ecotourism industry. So the goal of this project was to restore the degraded land, targeting areas of abandoned tin mines, to create jobs and ecotourism, and then to sequester carbon, as well as providing other ecosystem services.
Emma?
Yes.
Just stop you briefly. I don't think we can actually see your slides.
Oh.
At least I can't see it, and we also have the question in the chat.
There we go.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
That looks
Can you
better.
see them now?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry about that. So what I'm going to talk about today is how we actually went about quantifying and monetizing the costs and benefits of this mangrove park restoration project. And I'm going to focus a lot on how we built a system dynamics model. So for those of you who have participated in some of our past events, you may be familiar with some of the methods that I'm going to present. I'm going to start with what we call a causal loop diagram. And for those of you who this is your first event or perhaps have not seen a causal loop diagram before, this is essentially just a system map that helps us understand how different parts of the environment, as well as the social system, interact with each other to explain the behavior that we've observed. So the way this works is we start by putting down sort of some of the important pieces of the system. So here we have mines and we have household income. And we have connected these with an arrow, which just shows a causal relationship. So we know that when there are more mines, that's going to increase household income. And because these two variables change in the same direction, we label the arrow with a plus sign. At the same time, as the household income increases, there becomes less need for new mines. And so in this going in this direction, we see that these variables change in opposite directions. With more household income, there's less need to expand the mining area. So what this means is this creates what we call a balancing feedback loop, which we've labeled here with a B. And balancing feedback loops, they balance what's happening, or in other words, they help to dampen the change. But of course, these mines also have many other impacts on the system. So for example, mining is a very dangerous activity, and with more mines, mortality increases in the area. At the same time, the mines encroach on the mangroves. And with the loss of mangroves, that hurts the shrimp fishery. The shrimp stock actually goes down. Because this shrimp fishery is an important piece of the economy, with less shrimp, that's going to hurt household income. And this creates what we call a reinforcing feedback loop. And reinforcing feedback loops amplify change. So in this case, if we start over here and we say that the mangrove area is decreasing, and that's going to decrease the shrimp stock, that will lower household income, which means that there's more need to expand the mines, and consequently, there will be an even smaller area of mangroves. So we can also think about this as a vicious cycle of mangrove degradation. As the mangrove area decreases, we also see that carbon storage is going to decrease, and flooding is going to get worse. This flooding is also made worse by sea level rise, and so this tells us that the loss of mangroves actually makes this area more vulnerable to climate impacts. One way to address this flooding would be through gray infrastructure, such as a breakwater, which is just an offshore structure that helps to reduce some of the wave energy. But what we'll notice based on this diagram is that building a breakwater might have an impact on flooding, but it doesn't do anything to address the household income or other pieces of this system. So instead, we could focus on planting mangroves. And if at the same time, there was also an investment in ecotourism, then what we would see here is that the increase in mangrove area would support tourism that would increase the household income for the area, which reduces the need to encroach on the mangroves, and consequently the mangroves are able to continue to recover. So this represents another reinforcing feedback loop, but going in this direction, this is more of a virtuous cycle that represents sustainable mangrove management. So this is a very simplified representation of the causal loop diagram that we use for this assessment. If you're interested in seeing the larger causal loop diagram, I would encourage you to check out the report that's available online. But just in the interest of time, I am going to move on to then the next step in the process, which is how we actually translate this qualitative diagram to a quantitative model. And we do that using something called a stock and flow diagram, which I'm going to show on the next slide. So here, this little piece of the stock and flow diagram, again, this is just a subset of what we actually used for the assessment, is representing this relationship right here, where the mines encroach on the mangroves. And in this diagram, the rectangles represent stocks. And so these are just things that have changed over time. And these large arrows are what we call flows, which represent how those stocks change. So we can actually put equations into these flows, into these arrows, that allow us to simulate the change over time. So for example, we can put an equation in here for mangrove destruction, and that will tell us how quickly the mangroves are converted to tin mines. And then based on the lifetime of those tin mines, they eventually will become abandoned mines. And then finally, we can put an equation in here for how many mangroves are planted and what area is restored to then simulate the change from abandoned mines to mangroves. And so as I mentioned, this is just a small piece of the model, and we can build similar stock and flow structures for other parts of the system and then connect them to each other. So for example, we could use this area of mangroves stock as an input to calculating the flood damages. But now I'm just going to move on to show what type of output we can get from this type of model. So specifically, I'm going to show how we simulate the area of mangroves over time. And what you'll notice here is that probably the most obvious thing is these big drops that happen twice throughout the simulation. In this model, we assume that 2 tsunamis will hit this area. And so of course, these tsunamis are going to have a very large impact on the area of the mangroves. And that's what we're seeing here with these drops. The other thing you'll notice is that we have several different scenarios. So first, we have our business as usual scenario where no intervention is made. And that's this line here. So what we notice is that the area of mangroves decreases in response to both erosion as well as the expansion of tin mines. A tsunami hits, which decreases the area. We see that there's maybe some very small recovery. Then there's a second tsunami, which almost entirely wipes out the area of mangroves. If instead we look at this scenario, which we call plant mangroves, so that's where the only action that's taken is planting some mangroves, what we notice is that it looks almost exactly the same as business as usual. And that's because without providing an additional source of income, there's a lot of pressure to continue converting the mangroves to tin mines. And so whatever is planted is just destroyed. If instead we look at this purple line, which is our planting mangroves with the ecotourism, we see that the mangroves are able to actually recover. The tsunami still has an impact, but after that tsunami, we see further recovery. But with the second tsunami, what we notice is that the area of mangroves falls below some threshold, which means they're not able to support ecotourism, and there's a reversion back to that tin mining activity. So we then look at kind of a fourth scenario, which is this green line here that we call local stewardship. And what we mean by local stewardship is that there's a concerted effort by the local community not to encroach on mangroves. So a recognition that there might be some years where ecotourism maybe is less profitable, but that even with that, there's value in conserving the mangroves and not going back to the tin mining activities. So in this case, what we see is that even though that second tsunami has a large impact, the mangroves are able to continue recovering. And this, of course, is very different from our gray infrastructure scenario, the breakwater, which has almost no impact on the area of mangroves and looks very similar to business as usual. So moving on, I'm now going to talk about how we can use this output to calculate our integrated cost-benefit analysis. So in the next slide, I'm going to show the indicators that we actually included in the assessment. So we look at the direct costs of planting and maintaining mangroves, the costs of building the ecotourism infrastructure, and the costs of the breakwater. For the added benefits, we look at household income, and then we also quantify the avoided costs of carbon emissions, flood damages, and mortality. So in the next slide, I'm going to show the outputs of this cost-benefit analysis. And what we notice here is that in the plant mangrove scenario, the costs are very close to zero. They're showing up as a zero here because it's actually 0.000 something. So there is a very small cost. But the benefits are also very close to zero. So our net benefits are almost negligible. This is very different from the ecotourism scenario, where the costs are larger, but we have huge benefits, primarily in the form of household income from that ecotourism. And so this means that our net benefits are much higher. When we include that local stewardship, so there's a concerted effort not to encroach on the mangroves, we see that the net benefits are even higher. And then the breakwater, although it's cheaper than that ecotourism infrastructure, the benefits are much smaller, and so we have very small net benefits. So these results here are all undiscounted, but the next piece of our analysis is to include a discount rate and do what we would consider a financial analysis. So in this case, we're calculating the internal rate of return, the benefit to cost ratio, and the net present value. And first we do what we call the sustainable calculations. So that's where we include all of the added benefits and avoided costs from the cost benefit analysis. And then we do what we call the conventional calculations, where we exclude the avoided costs and look only at the added benefits and the direct costs. So here I'm going to show the results of this financial analysis. And what you'll notice is that for this plant mangrove scenario, there's a huge internal rate of return. And that's because, as you may recall, the costs were very, very small. But the benefits were also very small. And so we see that there is a very low net present value. This is different from the two scenarios that include ecotourism, where we see that there's still a high internal rate of return. There's also a high benefit to cost ratio and a much higher net present value. which of course is very different from the breakwater that performs poorly on all of these indicators. So just to summarize our results, first, what we see is that ecotourism is very important in creating long-term benefits, and that investing in the mangrove rehabilitation is only sustainable over the long term if there's also an additional source of revenue for the local community. We also see that extreme events threaten the mangroves and the local economy. In this case, we were looking at the impact of tsunamis, but coastal storms could also show similar outputs. And so because of this, it's very important for there to be that sort of local stewardship and recognition that the mangroves provide value. Finally, although I didn't show different climate scenarios here, we did actually simulate that. You can see that in the report. And we're able to see that this restoration project will increase climate resilience. And by comparing it to gray infrastructure, we see that mangroves are a more cost-effective way to mitigate flooding than that breakwater. And so with that, I now want to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Emma, for this really insightful presentation on the mangrove restoration project. A couple of questions have come in already, some of which are related to the first part of the presentation, where you looked at the causal loop diagram. And I think we can lump these questions together because it's really about how a better understanding of the pluses and minuses on the causal loop diagram. One between the shrimp stock and household income, and mangrove areas and carbon storage, as well as mangrove stock relating to flood damage. So I think you can lump them together because they refer to the same points.
Yeah, so the most important thing to remember about the pluses and minuses is that a plus means that the two variables change in the same direction, and a minus means that they change in opposite directions. So it's not necessarily saying that they increase or decrease, it's whether they're changing together or opposite. So I think one of the questions was around the shrimp stock and the household income. So again, with more shrimp, there's more household income. With less shrimp, there's less household income. So they're changing in the same direction. And then, when we think about the sort of the land cover with more mines, there's less mangrove. There's less mines, there's more mangrove. So I hope that answers that question. It's a little bit confusing, but just remember, same direction or opposite direction.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Emma. And next question from Alice. How do you integrate in the system the impact of local stewardship? Which equations are you using, and are you integrating possibilities like if a segment of the community would not comply?
So we don't look at kind of this sort of non-compliance. You could think about that as almost the first scenario of that planting mangroves with ecotourism. And then we assume sort of full compliance where there's no more encroachment. So when we don't include that local stewardship, what we assume is that the encroachment into the mangroves is tied directly to the community income. But in the local stewardship scenario, we basically disconnect that. So we say, even if income decreases, there still will not be any encroachment. So it's just, instead of having a specific equation to represent that local stewardship, it's really just disconnecting those two different dynamics.
Thank you, Emma. Then there's a couple of questions that I'm going to lump together because they actually have to do with how we deal with uncertainty in the analysis. How do we go about defining ecotourism? Because of course it makes a huge difference if we have to fly there, which is Ines's point, but it also relates to what someone else is flagging in the chat on the results are sensitive to assumptions. So how do we deal with that? Can you reflect on that a little bit?
Yeah, so first thinking about the impact of flying and how we actually get to these locations, we're only looking at the impact to the local community. So in this case, for the tourism benefit, the only sort of impact that we're valuing is how much income the local community would get. So we're not considering sort of the impacts of the travel itself. In terms of uncertainty, there are a few different ways that we can handle this. So we can do kind of sensitivity analysis to think about, what would happen if there was less tourism than we expect, or if there was more, and we can just run the model looking at those different scenarios. That's often what we do. We can also do what's called a Monte Carlo simulation, where we're actually defining different ranges for those parameters and then getting a range of outputs.
Thanks for that. Another question, and I'm mindful of time. We're gonna take two more. So one is in relation to the costs and benefits for specific groups. There's obviously the local communities, there's governments, there's businesses. How can we reflect that in the assessments, and have we done that specifically in this one?
So in this one, we've focused primarily on the local community. So again, thinking about that income from the tourism. But of course, not everything is there. So we also look at the value of carbon storage, which would not be something that the community would get directly unless there's some sort of carbon payment system. And so what we do is we are actually quantifying the costs and benefits for different groups. But that allows us to think about the value for society as a whole. And then in our reports, you'll notice we often do break it down and kind of say, these benefits would benefit this group, these ones would accrue to this other group. And so we can actually break it down that way. But then we combine it all together to look at that full societal value.
And then another short question, I think, did you make the local assessment to how long will it take for the mangroves to regrow on post-mining areas, and was that taken into account into the modeling?
Yeah, so we do model we have the bare land, abandoned tin mines, and then it takes a few years to actually plant those mangroves, at which point they're these seedlings, sort of secondary forest, and then I believe we make an assumption that after 20 years, the mangroves are sort of reaching maturity. Although the specific number will be in the report. So we do kind of break it down to these young mangrove seedlings and then the mature mangroves.
Thank you so much.
The young mangroves provide some benefits, but not as much as the mature ones, just to clarify.
Just to close off on this assessment, there was one question on whether this is a real world project, which it is, but what the financing structure for implementation was. If you have any information on that, Emma.
I'm trying to remember for this project. I can't recall off the top of my head how it was implemented, but this is a real world project that the community did sort of come together to implement.
Great, thank you. Now we're coming up to the end of this webinar. Time certainly was flying. Lots of great questions. So really want to thank the audience here for being so active with asking questions. And of course, if there's remaining questions that you have, please do feel free to contact us. Also want to thank Emma, Georg, and Ronja, as well as other colleagues who've been active in the chat responding to questions. Thank you so much for being here. Don't know if Emma or Ronja could quickly pull up the slides again, because as always, it's really important for us to hear from all of you some quick feedback. And so I'm going to ask my colleague Ronja to put in the chat a quick link to a 3-minute survey, and if you could take 3 minutes of your time to fill that out, that would be great. There are 2 messages that I want to leave the audience with. One is that we are always looking for projects to which we can, for which we can use the different tools and methods to value them. So should you be working on nature-based infrastructure currently, or if you are working on the preparation of projects for which these type of valuations, this type of analysis might be of use, we have ongoing support available to provide these on a pro bono basis. So If you're interested, please do contact us and reach out, and we'd be really happy to engage with you. And then the other message I want to leave you with is an invitation to join us on the next webinar, which is where we will dive into a case study from Colombia, from the La Mojana wetland area, and where we'll be talking about the importance of finding integrated solutions between built and nature-based solutions to address issues of flooding and as well as drought cycles. And then the last session will dive into another case study of Indonesia once again, where we'll provide you with some of the findings from the assessments there. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you to my colleagues who've been joining us today. Thank you so much to the audience for amazing questions and for being with us. And we hope to see you on the 29th of March for another discussion. Thank you so much, and wishing you a great rest of the day.